All right. So for those new here, typically the lesson flow is usually focused around using the browser and a particular set of web pages that I put together kind of for like the lesson series. This is all located at this GitHub page. You don't need to know, exactly what GitHub is right now, but it's a way of like hosting code that you write. So I have a project here. This is publicly accessible. You don't need like any authentication to use this. And I just have a project here that just has a bunch of different resources and some links and some other helpful stuff. But it also has a sample page that I've kind of been using as a reference for some of the concepts that we might cover or review. And again, most of the stuff, we're focusing on web topics like web technologies, basic web technologies that are in the browser. So we're going to kind of continue with that. And today we're going to try to wrap up the remaining stuff that I wanted to talk about with specifically CSS technologies. So just kind of a review of kind of like what CSS is relative to some of the other web technologies that you might have heard of. So there's the three core technologies that we're concerned with, which are going to be HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so whenever I talk about those things, trying to distinguish them, if you're talking about like making a web page, like I want to put together a web page, something like this, maybe that has some links. What do I need to know about each technology, and how do I distinguish them? Like, when do I know to use what? So I've kind of come up with like it's not really dogma, but it's kind of like a way of understanding sort of the intent behind each of these technologies. So for HTML, you're going to be using that to describe the organization and content of a page. So for example, here, I have some like large sections indicating like that, each of these you could consider a section. They're kind of split up by these headers, and then within these sections I have some content, which happens to be links. So I would focus on HTML to do this. And I'll try to show you side by side as we go, sort of the code that's actually involved in doing some of this organization. But for HTML, something that's weird. Let me try to close this. My browser is kind of freaking out. So we're going to try that again. Not necessarily a super well-known colloquialism, or maybe you've heard it, but that would be considered a bug. And while I get this up and running again, the backstory on the word bug, I don't know if anyone knows this, but it comes from old computers that were made of actual machine parts. And this computer scientist found a bunch of bugs inside the computer one time. So that's where that comes from.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like a bunch of moths, I think, or something. So it was literally a bug. Yeah, that's where that comes from. Okay, we're back, I think. Yeah, my browser is working. I don't know what happened there. So what I was trying to do is trying to get to this context menu. I'm not sure if you can see this. Can you see this right-click menu?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So this is kind of an important aspect of using the browser to write code, is you want to be able to see what your code is doing and see like the direct consequence of the code you've written. So we were just talking about HTML that we would use to organize content on a page. And so we can look at this HTML directly using a quick tool that all browsers are going to have. If you right-click, you can use inspect element, and you're going to be able to see this inspector content here. In Chrome, it might look different. It might be called elements, I think. But it's just this basic view that the gist or the point of this view is to show you the like HTML that comprises like the document that you're viewing, this web document. And the idea here is to let you debug or kind of figure out like the underlying organization of a document. Like, why is the document rendered the way it is? So
HTML as well as the CSS, right?
yes, yeah, as well as the CSS. So if I wanted to consider something on the CSS side of things, so let's say we separate just the basic organization of content on our page. So we have some headings, we have some links. This is all explained by CSS here. So you can see this A, right? This is like a link. This describes this. You can see the second A. This describes this link, okay? So if we jump over to the CSS, like Austin mentioned, we can do that by looking at the style editor, but we can also do it right here, actually. This is like a convenient portal for looking at the CSS that applies to particular elements. They're called organizational like items on our page. This is like a nice quick port into the CSS applied per each element. It'll also tell you where we get the like the source for the style. These are called styles. It'll also tell us where this style came from. So I know that this is like the element styling being used, but if we want to know where it came from, we can click this link, and it'll take us where I was pointing before, the style editor. This is just going to show you the CSS or style sheets you've included. So just to kind of like reiterate, what is CSS? CSS is style, like could be like a pretty vague term for it, but the term that I like to think of, or the terms I like to think of, I like to use CSS as something to clarify or to decorate or like separate content. It's kind of like a distinguishing sort of a framework for like outlining existing organization or maybe giving clarity to existing organization. So I use CSS here to color these headers blue. I also used it to give a particular font family. But I might also use things, as we're gonna hopefully get into more today, I might also use CSS to space elements apart. So let's go to this resources page, which I put together. So this page, like, is just a series of links that I put together that I think, so hopefully some people might find helpful. But you can see here, there's like a lot more kind of like organizational complexity happening. Not too much, but definitely a little bit more. We have lists now, like with these bullets. And then we have like sublists within this like major list. So you can see I've kind of sectioned these things. And again, if we want to look at like, well, how is this, how did this content come about? Like, how did it get organized like this? We're looking at the element inspector here to kind of understand how this content came about, like why it's rendered this way. So we can see here, there's this, as a refresher for HTML, it's an unordered list element, so it's going to contain list items. These are list items, so each one of these is a list item. You can see there's one for each of these bulleted points on the page. And then actually this unordered list, it's called an unordered list. You can see the bullets there. So instead of numbers, that would be an ordered list. This is actually within its own list item. So that's how you get this here. So we can kind of like round everything up and see where this organization's coming from. And then the reason I wanted to bring us over to this page is it does have a little bit more complex styling going on, not by much, but if we walk over to the style editor again, yeah, not by much at all. It just has like one more style, this line height. But I wanted to bring us over here because it's something we can play with. And since we use CSS to kind of like separate or sort of like clarify our existing structure on the page, we can do things like maybe give some more space between the individual list items. We can do things like increase this indent here. These are all things that you would do with CSS because they don't change the actual content of the page. We're not really focused on doing that. We're more focused on like embellishing on the content that's already there. So that's kind of like the preface of sort of what we're going to go over today. It's sort of some like very particular CSS concepts. I know for some of you that have just joined recently, this might be like a bit fast. And if it is, that's okay. We have the videos like in a repository on YouTube. I would encourage you to like look at some of those if you're more interested in going back, but I promise I won't be like, I won't try to build on too much like pretext, because I know, again, for some of you joining, I want to make sure you get something out of it. So we're just going to focus on some CSS concepts that don't necessarily need you to understand anything other than that, this is an element. I created it using HTML, and now we're going to use CSS to decorate it. And just to clarify, all of this code for this page is right here. So you can see this URL here. We can use that to kind of figure out where this HTML file is coming from. So if I go over to my project here, I go over to resources, and I can see helpful links here. And here's our HTML. So, maybe you were wondering like, well, how does the HTML come about? Like where did this HTML come from? And it's just right here in a code file I created. So you could copy this and do whatever you wanted to do with it. It's, it's totally open for your use, or if you want to mess around with it and figure out how I laid things out. But this is just, this is the core HTML, and it's rendering here, and this inspector is just showing us what we wrote. So let's go back.
You get from the inspector to the other screen that you were just showing?
Oh, yeah, sure.
HTML?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this page?
Yeah.
So that's kind of a step I'm kind of skipping over, but basically this has to do with kind of like hosting a project using GitHub, like GitHub's sort of ability to let you store code, and then depending on the kind of code it is, especially if it's native web code, like if the code you host on GitHub can run in a browser, you can do this cool thing called a Github Page, which lets you basically create, like GitHub will basically host your code as a web page. So this is just kind of like a convenience, but I'll tell you a quicker answer that you can do like right at home. So what you can do is if you have these files like just organized in this same way in this folder, what you could do like from the comfort, like without having a hosting service or anything, you can actually just put that folder locally on your computer, like on your desktop. So I'll do it now. Let me just find the directory. So I'm going to let me just share my full screen here so that you can see okay, so you should be able to see the my folders here. Yeah, so this is, I actually have this code like on my computer. I don't just have it on this website. So what I can do is I can actually have this folder here. I can actually take this file, this HTML file, I can go to the browser, I can pop it in, and it will load just like that. I actually changed it on my computer before I've updated the code on this website here. But yeah, so that's how you get, as you're saying, from sort of a file to how do I get this in the browser? Your browser is ready to just gobble up like as long as it's properly formed and stuff, like a native web code. So you can get started. In fact, that's like the easiest way to get started. It's just create an HTML file, try to open it in the browser. If it doesn't work, something's wrong with the HTML, kind of rinse and repeat. But yeah, this is, so that, to answer your question, I'm using this GitHub Pages project. And I actually have a link to that here. So I'd recommend it. It's very cool. It's a really convenient way to show people your work. But yeah, that is a good point to be clear about. It's like this, when we're looking at this inspector, what we're looking at is the browser's interpretation of the HTML that you've written. And then what it's going to do is kind of rehash that same HTML, but with some sort of like attributions or little sort of like notes that the browser is going to make about the way that it sort of put everything together. So for instance, it added this little marker note here because every list item, the way that HTML or the browser renders list items, it adds a little bullet. And so the browser is telling you right now, like, hey, I have a marker element here for you that represents this list item. So yeah, there's that'll take us from kind of like A to B. So if we want to kind of go back in the direction of CSS, or did that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. No, I was
okay,
just
cool.
like, you said you skipped a step, and I was like, did I miss a step? But no, that totally,
yeah.
that completely makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Please feel free to interrupt me if I skip something, because I definitely want, all of this should be reproducible. So that's like a big part of this. So I'm gonna go back to just sharing the browser to kind of make things a bit simpler. But what I'm going to do is get into some sort of particular CSS concepts. Last time we talked about a couple of different things, and again, I'll try to rehash them a little bit, but last time we talked about a few concepts. In particular, we talked about the containing block. And just to quickly summarize this, though I would recommend reading through this document and kind of like, it's a good introductory document. You don't need to know too much. You maybe just a little bit of understanding about, these are elements that I set out to create with my HTML. And the idea is that basically every HTML element is a box. So that's pretty important for understanding CSS moving forward from there. And it's not too complicated to kind of wrap your head around. Every time you create an element on a web page, the browser actually puts a box around it. And that's just what the browser does. It for convenience, renders everything as a box. If you want things to not look, boxy, there's all kinds of tricks you can use CSS with. You can use CSS for to kind of like mitigate, sort of like box shaping. But, the important thing to understand is that we're going to take advantage of this fact when we write CSS, or we're going to make sure to keep it in mind when we're writing CSS, when we're trying to specify things like width and height and, sort of dimensions for these elements. But in particular, the containing block, that part of the box is just important to note that that's this content area. So this content area is like the containing block. That's what this is. Okay, cool. So why are containing blocks important? Well, containing blocks, contain things. So it's important to keep in mind, first of all, when you're writing, when you're writing CSS code, like what your CSS is actually applying to. If you have selectors, which are basically the tools that we use in CSS to sort of mark things that we want to apply styles to, you need to put your selectors on the correct elements so that the style that you want is applied to the containing block in the way that you expect. So I'm going to try to unpack that phrase a little bit more. before we get into what I wanted to reach first, which is document sizing. So I'm going to kind of pull this up in the background just so we have it. We did talk a little bit about this last time, but I didn't get into it too much. But you're going to see these kind of properties come up a lot, not just for font size. You can click this, and you'll see it come up though for just sizing anything in general. It's in fact the kind of like way that, for instance, if you look at the computed size of one of our boxes, you'll see that pixels come up, which we'll see right here, or px as like a metric for understanding the size of like a block. So this page is discussing font size in particular. Font size is going to control, it's a little bit misleading because font size can end up controlling a lot of different things. But and you can kind of see how that might come up here. For example, like if I change the font size, not only does it change the, you know, this actual, like the sizing of this text here, but it's also going to like adjust the sort of like what's called like the word wrap for this containing block. So what we're doing here on this web page, by the way, is we're just changing the CSS properties of this containing element here. And you'll notice, yeah, like the number of words that can fit on each line are changing each time. So this is something that font size does aside from just changing like the size of your font. And that should probably be intuitive. I mean, if you've used like a word processor, this is something that happens. You know, you change the font and then all of a sudden your paragraph is extending further down the page. You know, the same thing happens on a web page. It's not like impervious to this kind of thing. So what I wanted to explore is like how the px sort of metric is used elsewhere. Like how can we understand a size within a document? So px does represent pixels. It's like the number of pixels in terms of maybe like the width of a box. So in this case, you see when I hover over this element, this is a containing block. Okay, so this blue here that you're seeing, that's a containing block. And you can see the width as the first number. I can maybe make it stay, yeah. So this first number I'll try to show you with just my mouse. Then the number directly above my mouse, this is the width in pixels, or px. Okay, and the number to the right is like the height of the box in px. And it also tells us here, it's got this convenient tool for giving us the class attribute that we've associated with the element, which we'll kind of often use for CSS as a way of giving styles to elements. So maybe I should address that really quick because I think it's kind of important. So if I go back to my inspector and let's say I want to change the like a style. So maybe I want to change the color again. Here it's green, but maybe we want to change that to a different color. If I want to do that, I can do it most conveniently for the inspector is to do it here. It's just basically listing out style attributes associated like specifically with this element. So I could just add it here. It would be pretty convenient. You know, we see this other rule that we already have. Oops, I lost it. We see this other rule below that I already have. It's called color. So we can just copy that and we can put it on the element itself. And we can change it. We can use, this is just a keyword. We can use blue and now it's all of a sudden it's blue. You'll notice that when I do that, what happens is it adds what's called an attribute. So if this is the element, which is an H3, it just means like header type 3, this h3. When I add a style here, what it's doing is it's adding an attribute to my element called style. And style is just like a catch-all attribute for basically putting CSS, what's called like inline, onto an HTML element. So I'm just inlining this CSS, this styling, directly on this piece of my HTML code. And I'm making it blue, like right here in the inspector. So when I add this, it means that it's not only particular to this element, but like I'm not going to see it anywhere else. Like this style is just particular to this H3, this specific H3. I even have other H3s on the page, right? But if we scroll up to one of them, well, we can just use our inspector. So if I go up to this one, like this is also an H3 element, but it doesn't have the blue color. So this style attribute only gets applied here. And we can actually do this if we go back to our code. Oops, let's do this one. We can do that here. There's nothing stopping us from doing it in the actual source code. I just want to make that clear. Like this is just a way of like looking at our what's called our source code.
Called H3Y again?
It's just like a I don't really know like why they went with that, but yeah, they just decided to make like this series of different heading, like they're kind of like they're like sizes, but they're also like they describe some other things. So they also describe by default like
I think I get it.
Indent. Yeah, they
Realized H was a header.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry if I wasn't clear about that. Yeah. So the H comes from header, and then H1 being like the largest header that you would have.
Well, I mean, there's
and,
H5 or whatever. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. They just keep getting smaller. H6 is being the smallest. And then if you indent them, or I'm sorry, if you like indent them, you can. It's a convenient way of sort of like separating content. Again, like with HTML, we're really going for organization and content. I think one thing to point out that maybe if you feel like maybe you kind of lost the thought on distinguishing HTML, like the purpose from CSS, especially with something like this, where it's like, well, I thought you said that HTML was for content only. So with HTML, I should only be doing things like, all right, I want to have links to these pages, and I want to have some text, and I want to have maybe some images or some organization. But now all of a sudden with this kind of like header element, I'm now like also doing some implicit like size and scale. And so yeah, that kind of does like overlap with CSS a bit. And the reason for this is actually these elements are really old. They actually predate CSS. So HTML was created as like a primary, like first technology. And at the time it was just meant to do everything. And then, we acquired CSS, like someone came up with CSS, and then later we acquired JavaScript. But yeah, so in older HTML, this was a way of doing both those things. So that's just kind of a sidetrack to note, like, yeah, this isn't the best sort of like way of separating the idea of just content and decoration or embellishment or like scale and stuff like that. So that's a good side note.
I have a question.
Oh, sure.
Should you avoid stuff like those parts of HTML that kind of influence style, and try to keep it, like, I don't know if there's like a good practice when writing this kind of code where you want to keep it all in CSS or or whatnot. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And yes, you can. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, what I would say to answer kind of the first part a little bit further, it can get, depending on what you want to do, depending on how complex your organization is. For example, this content, and you can already kind of see it even cropping up. I mean, I'm using just very like sort of introductory HTML here, but I also notice when I think about it, the kind of implicit problems in separating the sort of CSS approach of, okay, like now I want to give this content some life, and the HTML designation. I mean, you notice here with these lists, right? Like I don't have a specification in my style sheet that says this list should have this bullet and it should look like this, right? So this is another, you can guess, carry over from old HTML where the separation,
okay.
yeah, the separation of responsibility is not always clear. But yeah, so then to extend the answer, I don't know if I actually covered this in depth before, so maybe it's a good sidetrack. But there is a series of elements that we can use in HTML. I actually don't use any on this page at all because I was just making some simple lists. But on this sample page, I do use some. And I think it could be good to address them. So these, just from what, and I actually haven't, funnily enough, an example that they similar to the one they have here, but that's okay. So these, like, we're pretty familiar with, right? Like we have, I mean, obviously now we are, we just talked about headers. I have a link, so cover that. There's the link that I'm talking about, and the list, just like we have on the other page. Okay, I have some more, maybe some, like these are also lists, but they look a little more complex, but they're really not. These, I might add, are in fact specified within my CSS. So this is a good example of one way to kind of address this is what's called, what's a good word for it? It's not really, I don't want to call it an override, but it kind of is an override. So what I've done here is I'm using selectors, class selectors, which, and I think I mentioned that, and I'm sorry if I mention something and then I don't explain it. So I know, hopefully, just maybe pester me. But in this case, I think I mentioned class enough that it's probably important to point out really quickly. But remember how we had our style attribute? Style attributes are special. They're meant to like as like a special placeholder for inline CSS. So they are actually like the content of a style attribute is actually interpreted by the browser. Like it looks at a style attribute and it says, okay, I need to use this CSS that you gave me. A class attribute is like much simpler, and I think much, it's incredibly flexible and useful. A class attribute is essentially a way for us to give some sort of like semantics or kind of like human meaning to like these elements and organization specifically. What I mean by organization is like how you would group fruits and vegetables and other foods or something, like in your head, like with a mental map. We can actually do this within our HTML, and I'll actually hop back to the HTML that's actually on the page or in our actual, where is it? Oh, I keep flipping back and forth. Here we go. I'll actually hop to the HTML that we have in our code repository because I think it's easier to read faster. But you can see I use classes a lot. And these terms, if they looked like code, they're actually not code. These aren't interpreted by the browser in any way other than as like a reference or like a lookup. And just for the sake of simplicity, for now, they're only used for CSS, or rather the CSS engine, the thing that takes our CSS and turns it into these, beautiful like styles and colors and stuff. This is going to look up a class from my document, and it's going to use my selector here, my selector syntax, to determine whether the element that I am kind of like looking at should be styled or not. So I can use classes to make my CSS easier to write and easier to organize. So let's look at an example use of a class, particularly again, to address like Moses's question about like, how can we really take control of our presentation, the split between our presentation and our organization, our content. So in this case, what I've done is I took this ordered list, or unordered list, sorry. I took this unordered list and I applied a class to it. I called it nav, so we can find that here. I gave it a class nav. I made that up, like that's not a special keyword like unordered list is. I made that up. And then what I did in my CSS here, and again, this is separate code like language from the HTML. I think it's pretty clear that it is. I mean, it looks very different, but just to be very clear, this is a separate like set of code, CSS code. It's the same thing that's showing up right here, and it's the same thing that shows up right here. So you could look at this and compare it, and it's literally line by line should be the exact same code. So I guess it's nice to look at it here too, but this makes it easy for us to jump around pretty quickly. So if we go and find the nav reference in here, what we're doing, this period lets us select a class within our HTML. So it lets us say, hey, any element with this class, specifically any unordered list element, if you have this class attribute that says nav, and this part is a little bit more nuanced to understand, but what this means is that if you, as a unordered list element with class nav, contain a list item element, so that gets back to our like containing block. These list items are in the containing block for this UL, this unordered list. So if I go back here, what I've told it to do is I've told it to give a margin left of 3 rem. This is just another one of those size metrics that we can use. It's just telling us the size of the element, or in this case, like the sort of relative size, because this is a relative attribute. Relative attribute just means like it's a scale. So you can see here what this is saying is the size of a particular element is going to be 0.8 of the base size that you set for the total document. Yeah, so hopefully that's a little clear. So if I said the font size was like 12 pixels for the whole document, then let's find a good example of one. What this is saying, is saying that the padding for this particular element, any div element that's centered, and maybe I shouldn't have picked that one. That one's for a more complicated example, but this one is pretty much the same thing. We can just ignore the first child for now. So this is just saying like it's 6 times the base font size. This is just actually, it just means root element. And yeah, so it's just a scalar. It's not anything too wild. I could replace this with the number 6 times 12 px, if that was the font size for my page, and it would work the same way. So coming back here, how did I get this styling for these list items? What I did was, I do actually have to introduce children, but that's okay. I think it's a good time to do it. So after I set the margin, which is basically just exactly what it sounds like. It's like a margin on like a piece of notebook paper. It's this width here. We can actually, it's like this width that we can actually modify. So probably helpful to see it. So you can see as I'm increasing this number, so you can see this increasing. It's moving. And you can notice actually that I think this helps illustrate the scale. I want to point something out, that this is a scalar value. So it's saying ×2, ×3 of the base font of the page. What's interesting about this is that you can see this happening for the metric that's being used to like figure out the size of this box, the boxes that we talked about earlier. So notice as I up this, I say 4, 5. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm actually squishing this box up against the right side of the page here. So it's actually decreasing in width. So you can see that happening, and you'll notice it's not going by 1 at a time, it's going by a multiple. It's changing by the same multiple each time. So yeah, pretty cool. This gets us to our next part of the CSS, which it's kind of, it looks kind of complicated, but it's not too complicated. What this is saying is I'm using CSS to basically do exactly what the browser does by default for, let's find our, oh yeah, we can use this link. I'm using what the browser does by default to add my own special bullet to these list items. And I'm overriding the default list item bullet that kind of comes as like stock. And what I'm saying here with this code is, oops, let me keep losing. Okay, here we go. So what I'm saying with my code here is I would like to get any list item with a nav class parent. So the better way, or the clearer way to have done this would have been to put UL again. But that's okay. Like, we didn't need to put UL again, because there's only, sorry, I keep hopping around. There's only there's only 2 list items in my HTML document that have a parent with class nav. So I would only be concerned about this CSS code. Oh wow, I keep hopping around. I would only be concerned about this CSS code not being specific enough if like I had different types of lists on my page, like ordered lists as well. But in this case, it's sufficient. I really didn't even need to say UL here, but I did to be very specific. So I'm saying any element with class nav, if you have a list item child, specifically the first child, so that means like literally, if we look at this box, okay, we're going to look at the UL box. So this is the box that contains my list items, right? So these list items are children of this box. The box has class nav. Within this box, I have these two list items. This is the first child, this one right here. And you can see here, we have the CSS rule that I set up in our base code. And it found it, and it said like, yeah, this is the first child. So of the parent with class nav. So I went ahead and applied the rule that you set out for me to apply. And this is just a special CSS keyword. It's a particular style. It's called list style. And what it lets you do is replace those bullets with a variety of options. We can actually look up this particular list styling on MDN. And MDN is something I think I've brought up before in the class, but it's a very, very useful sort of network of resources and documentation built by Mozilla, who creates Firefox. So I highly recommend it. They also have some really good web tutorials, which I put on the website here. So these, yeah, and some of, or no, yeah, just this one.
Can you put that that link in the chat?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah, let me actually go bring you to the root here. So this is just the GitHub page, and then what I'll also do is I'm also going to put the link to like the site, which you can just get to right here. So this is, like I was talking about, the project hosting capabilities, but you can just click this and it'll take you there. But I provided the link for that too. Okay, so this actually should have updated. I'm kind of surprised it didn't. I don't know what happened because I updated the code pretty recently. Sometimes it's a little finicky, GitHub is, in terms of like your page content refreshing, but otherwise I think it's pretty great because it's free, as is the MDN, to kind of circle it back. But so I wanted to just mention this list style. You know, I don't like, at my work, like I don't just like know all of these styles off the top of my head. I usually Google them. Like I know what I want to do, and then I just look up like, okay, I need to, like, what was that particular CSS attribute that I wanted to use? So in this case, it's list style, and you can see my example here. I did something similar, right? I just used a URL keyword. And what this is doing is just basically pointing you to somewhere in your project directory, your web project directory. It's pointing to a file, and it's letting you load the file, and it's letting you load it. So it's letting you load it as like a bullet. So that's it. That's, I mean, like, I don't know, maybe if that, I don't know how fantastical this example looked. I don't know if it's, I don't think it's super impressive. I think it's kind of cool that you can load GIF files. But I do think that it is kind of like a very unique way of rendering this like a series of items. You'll also notice I changed the font to this Futura font. And it wasn't that hard to arrive at. Like it's not that bad at all. As long as we understand how our page is organized and laid out.
So I saw on the example it said it was an SVG file, but you said here you can also do GIF files for that.
Yes.
List
Yeah.
style? Okay.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
JPEG and most of the stuff that we would recognize, you can just put that on there.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you can do,
Okay.
I think PNGs too. Yep, PNGs. You can also have external URLs, which is pretty cool. They don't have an example of doing that here. You can also just use like squares. Like there's keywords for this. So square inside means like, it means like, it's kind of hard to say. Oh wait, we can inspect. That's another thing that you'll get used to doing is like, whenever you're like, how did they do that? you can just look at it. You don't have to wait. So when they say inside here, this keyword, what it means is like it's putting the oh, and you should know the vocabulary word for this at this point. Maybe Austin can help us out if he knows what I'm saying. So the difference between these two things is that this bullet point is outside of the X, the containing blah, and this bullet is inside the containing blah. Does anyone want to maybe chime in? Oh, I realize it's really dark.
And you're asking why that is?
Oh, no, I'm just saying, oh, I think I said the word blah, which sounds like block. So I think I just kind of gave it away. But I meant to say containing X. But yeah, it's why that is just, they just decided that that would be useful. I don't know. I can't think of a particular, I mean, I guess maybe what you'd want, okay, I can kind of see it. So maybe you want to like create a margin between, you want to create maybe more space between the bullets themselves from the actual entry here. Yeah, I guess that's the only reason I can see why. So we can do that actually really quick. So I know this one off the top of my head just because I use it a lot, but we can use margin left. We can say 20px. Okay, so because this bullet is part, oh, whoops. Well, that didn't do what I expected. I guess it's still part of, technically, oh, I guess it's, yeah, it is including it here in this yellow. Maybe if we use padding. I'm getting a little bit experimental here. Okay, yeah, so it's padding. So I guess that does make sense, actually. The difference between margin and padding is padding is adding space within the containing block. So alongside like your text or whatever. So if this is, you can consider this element my block, and then this is the stuff inside, the content. Padding is going to give us space like along with the content. So it's going to expand our containing block. Margin is going to be outside of the containing block. So the reason that didn't work just now is because I'm modifying the like outside of the containing block. I'm adding space there, and then padding is adding it to the containing block. So it's actually just, you can think of it like it's pushing the block, it's squishing it out to the right, like it's making it wider, but it's doing it on the left side. If we did it on the right, I think nothing would happen. Yeah, we're not going to see anything. Yeah, nothing's going to happen. And it actually manifests, oh, let me get it better. Manifests here. You see that purple? It's trying to show us like you added this 20 pixels of space to the right, but this one doesn't have it. And so here.
But the padding is pushing against the margin, so it's not moving. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
Yes, exactly. You can
Something
think
like
of
that.
Yeah, you can think of like the containing block is almost like this this kind of like very flexible sort of squishy region, which is going to be confined to, this is where it gets a little complicated, but I think it's a good thing to introduce. It's going to be confined to any other containing block. So that's where padding gets a little bit confusing.
So there's like these subordinate kind of respect relationships.
That's right.
These things. Okay.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I'm not going to be able to do padding beyond, I don't think so. In some cases, you can set things up to like go outside. Yeah, I mean, in this case, what we've done is we've expanded the containing block. This one's also weird because it's like in an iframe, which I'm not gonna get too into, but iframes let you basically like scope a whole web page into like an HTML element. That is making things weird because now it's scrolling. You see this? So, but I can promise that basically what we're doing is we're affecting the containing block that is wrapped around this list. So you're constrained in terms of like, however, like whatever constraints are on this containing block. This containing block, this unordered list is pretty like liberal. It's letting us do kind of this crazy padding stuff, but you can do things like, and maybe we can mess with it. Min width, or we can say max width, I think. Which might bring us back. It kind of did. It made it really skinny. So we're almost there. But when I added all that padding, it like wrapped around. It's kind of confusing to think about. But this is the kind of stuff, unfortunately, that is super exciting that comes up with HTML. Let's try to get it again. Yeah, so see what it did? It like made it really skinny because I said, hold on, you can only be 10 pixels wide, even though you have this list item that is huge and you can see it, right? This purple. But it doesn't care because its containing block is wrapped, like it's wrapping this. So it's like, I don't care how wide, how much padding you have. Like I'm wrapping you and you're only 10 pixels. That probably just made things more confusing, but CSS in general is pretty confusing. So I think the best thing though you can do, the power of CSS comes from iterating and taking it one step at a time and saying, okay, what if I want to do this now? Like now that I have this base page, I'm going to try to extend it a little bit and do this. And I mean, iterative design for a web page is always going to be your best bet. Yeah, kind of adopting, expanded styles that kind of maybe get more nuanced or complex over time, while keeping things limited is really the best way to approach it. So a lot of your styles will interact with each other. There's things you can do to combat that, especially by not using attributes like this, which are pretty bad, like in general. They seem like they're good because they're constraining, but in reality, you get these unexpected behaviors. Like if you change the padding for one of these items, I expect it to do this padding modification, and I expect that to like manifest in some way on the page. And sometimes it turns out that it won't really do what I want. In this case, it worked out pretty well because, did I remove my containing block? Oh, in this case, it did because like we're not limiting what you can see, like with some kind of background or border or anything. So it'll still show up here. That's kind of why. But yeah, I think I'm going over time a little bit. So I do want to give anyone like a chance to kind of wrap up. I know I jumped all over the place, but yeah, if anyone has any questions, but yeah, sorry to go over a little bit. But I think that's
all good.
Yeah, I think that's it for this session.
Okay, so if, do you want to just summarize what we went over today?
Sure, yeah. We kind of reiterated some core concepts about CSS. We talked about elements. We tried to understand, how to distinguish, most importantly, between kind of like the role or the function of HTML versus the major function for CSS. Like what are the goals of either one? And we tried to dig into and got some results as far as learning how to associate styles or apply styles to certain elements. And I think mainly, hopefully what you took out of this, if anything, is that you know how to find the styles that are associated with an element and how to experiment and quickly add them on the page by just adding them straight into the browser here.
Wonderful. And so, like I said at the beginning, we have office hours with Page open to anybody Monday evenings from 6 to 8. And then we will be meeting in this format once again in 2 weeks. We didn't do any coding tonight, but if you want to hook with Page on Monday, I'm sure you can do that, or come back for our next session. This video will be up on YouTube and our Facebook page in the next couple days, so you can find that there, along with all the other videos that we have done. So thank you for joining us, and if anybody doesn't have any questions, then we'll call it a wrap.